The Haunted Bridge of Maine is a legend that has been whispered about in hushed tones for decades. It's not something people usually talk about unless they absolutely have to, and even then, it's only mentioned in passing, often with a nervous glance over the shoulder. The bridge itself is an eerie structure, set deep in the forests of Maine, hidden away from most modern roads, and far from the eyes of those who are afraid to face what's been left behind. It sits there, an old wooden thing, creaking with the wind and groaning as if it's alive, waiting to claim its next victim. But what makes this bridge so infamous? Why is it considered haunted by so many? It's because every night, as the clock strikes midnight, anyone who dares to cross the bridge disappears without a trace. And this isn't just a story for campfires or a ghost tale passed down to scare children. This is reality. People have crossed this bridge in the dead of night, and they vanished completely, leaving nothing behind but unanswered questions and fear in the hearts of the locals. It all started long ago, so long that even the elders in the area no longer remember the exact year it happened, but the story remains clear. The bridge was originally built as a passageway over a small river that ran through the dense forest. It was supposed to be a shortcut for travelers passing through the area, a convenient route for anyone who needed to get from one place to another quickly. It was the sort of bridge you'd expect to see in any old town, completely unremarkable at first glance. However, it didn't take long for the stories to begin. The first disappearance occurred just months after the bridge was completed. A young couple eager to start their new life together decided to take the bridge at night to avoid the long detour around it. They were crossing when they heard what sounded like a soft whisper, a voice carried on the wind. The couple stopped, looking around for the source, but the forest was still and silent. It was an odd noise, almost like a voice calling them from far away. They dismissed it as a trick of the mind. But as they continued to walk, the whisper grew louder, and a strange chill overtook the air. Before they could react, something tugged at the woman's dress. She cried out, but by the time her husband turned to help, she was gone, vanished into the darkness. No trace of her was found, and no one could explain what happened. Her husband was left standing there, speechless, unsure of what he had witnessed. He searched the bridge for hours, screaming her name, but no one came to help. When morning arrived, he was the only one left on the bridge, shaking with terror, unable to explain how his wife had simply disappeared. At first, people didn't believe the husband's story. They thought he had gone mad with grief, or perhaps had wandered into the woods and had made up the story. But soon after, another person vanished under similar circumstances. A local hunter, known for his rugged nature and toughness, had heard about the young couple's disappearance and decided to investigate the bridge for himself. Like the man before him, the hunter set out one dark night to cross the bridge. He too heard the whispers as he stepped onto the wooden planks. He called out, trying to make sense of it, but the more he called, the louder the whispering became. His heart raced as the wind howled around him, and his skin prickled with fear. Then, in the blink of an eye, he was gone. No one knew what happened to him, but the locals found his rifle, discarded on the edge of the bridge, the only clue left behind. The rest of his belongings were never found, and he too became part of the legend. That was just the beginning. As the years went on, more and more people disappeared. Some believed it was the curse of the bridge. Others thought it was the restless spirits of those who had passed over it in the past, still trying to make their way across to the other side. There were whispers of tragic accidents, of people dying while crossing and leaving behind souls that couldn't move on. Each year, another person would vanish, and no one could explain why. Soon, the locals learned not to go near the bridge after dark. It became a sort of unspoken rule. Don't cross the bridge at midnight. The hour between 11 and 12 became a dangerous time, and anyone who had to travel would make sure they avoided the bridge altogether, taking a long detour around it. People stopped speaking about it openly, but they'd glance at it nervously as they drove by, as if hoping that whatever haunted it would leave them alone. But no one dared venture onto it at night. Some tried, of course. There were always the thrill seekers, the ones who thought they could challenge the legend, the ones who were curious, the ones who believed it was all a myth and nothing more. But they were never heard from again. The stories became more terrifying with each passing year, and the bridge earned its title, the Haunted Bridge of Maine. The most chilling thing about the disappearances is that no one has ever made it across the bridge at midnight and lived to tell the tale. They simply vanish. No scream, no trace. They are just gone. Some say that the moment the clock strikes 12, the bridge transforms. It's as though it opens up a passage to somewhere else. A dark, otherworldly place where the souls of the lost wander forever. Others believe it's the spirits of those who were lost on the bridge long ago, still trapped in a never-ending cycle, pulling others in to join them. But what's truly terrifying is that there is no explanation for the disappearances. There are no clues, no evidence, no bodies found. It's like the people simply stepped off the face of the earth. The authorities have tried to investigate, but nothing ever turns up. They've examined the bridge, searched the nearby woods, but it's as if the people are swallowed by the darkness, leaving no trace behind. No one can explain it. Locals, especially those who've lived there for generations, will tell you that the bridge is cursed, but they'll never say why. They'll mention the disappearances, the whispers in the wind, the cold chill that seems to follow you once you set foot on the bridge. But they'll also tell you to stay away, because once you're on that bridge at midnight, there's no telling what might happen. Some say it's the spirits of the travelers who met their end there, still roaming the woods, lost and angry. Others think it's something far darker, an ancient evil tied to the land itself. And yet, despite all the warnings, the legend of the Haunted Bridge of Maine still draws people in. There are always those brave or foolish enough to test it. But no matter how many times it's told, no matter how many people are lost, the bridge remains. And every night at midnight, someone else crosses it, only to disappear without a trace, becoming part of the legend. And the people of Maine will continue to whisper the story, reminding each other of the bridge that waits for the next soul to cross it. But the question remains, why? Why does the bridge claim its victims? Is it a curse? Is it the work of restless spirits? Or something else entirely? No one knows. And perhaps that's the scariest thing of all, because as much as they try to avoid it, the bridge is always there, waiting, ready to take the next victim. No one has ever made it across at midnight and lived to tell the tale. And that's why the legend endures, because no matter how many times the story is told, the terror never stops. The bridge waits, and it will always claim those who dare to cross it. One chilly evening, Mark, Sarah, and Alex sat in the warmth of their living room, listening to the same old stories they had heard 100 times before. The legend of the Haunted Bridge of Maine was infamous in their small town. But like most of the people their age, they had grown up dismissing it as just a scare tactic for children and gullible adults. They had heard about the disappearances, the eerie whispers, and the cold, oppressive air that surrounded the bridge at midnight. But it all seemed so far-fetched. It was just an urban legend, nothing more. But tonight was different. Mark, always the adventurous one, had a gleam in his eye as he turned to his friends. "Let's just go and see for ourselves," he said, flashing a mischievous grin that seemed to dare anyone to object. He wasn't the type to shy away from a challenge, and this one, despite the stories, seemed like the perfect opportunity to prove to everyone that the whole thing was just a bunch of nonsense. No one ever went to the bridge at midnight, and that was exactly why he wanted to go. Sarah hesitated. She had heard the stories too, and despite her usually brave demeanor, something about this night felt off. The cold breeze outside, the way the trees swayed eerily in the wind, it all made her uneasy. But Sarah was also curious. Curiosity had always gotten the better of her. She exchanged a glance with Alex, who had been strangely quiet during the conversation. Alex was always the skeptic, the one who could talk down any ghost story or creepy legend. He was the kind of guy who believed in facts and logic. He wasn't easily spooked, not by something as absurd as a haunted bridge. So when he spoke up, it was with the confidence of someone who felt absolutely sure they were about to prove everyone wrong. "You know, it's all just a story," Alex said, shaking his head and letting out a small chuckle. "People get lost in the woods all the time. They probably just wandered off and got lost. There's no ghost or curse or anything, just a creepy old bridge in the middle of nowhere." Mark smiled. sensing an opportunity to goad Alex into joining the plan. Exactly. That's why we should go. We'll go, cross the bridge, and come back. Prove once and for all that it's just some old superstition. I bet we'll be laughing about it by the end of the night. Sarah gave a reluctant nod, though she couldn't shake the knot in her stomach. Something about the whole idea made her feel uneasy, like they were tempting fate. But deep down, she also wanted to prove herself. If it was just a story, there would be no harm, right? All right, she finally said, looking at both of them. But I'm not going on that bridge alone. We all go, or no one goes. And so, despite the unease gnawing at them, the three friends decided to drive to the infamous bridge that had captivated their town's imagination for generations. Around 11:45 p.m., they pulled up to the spot where the bridge stood. The car's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the twisted path leading up to the old structure. The bridge, overgrown with vines and moss, looked like something out of a nightmare. The trees surrounding it seemed to close in, casting long, dark shadows that stretched across the forest floor. The moonlight barely reached the ground, struggling to cut through the thick canopy of leaves above them. It was as if the bridge existed in a world of its own, one that had been cut off from the rest of reality. The air felt thick, like the entire forest was holding its breath. The moment they stepped out of the car, the cold hit them like a slap to the face. A chill that wasn't just from the evening breeze. It was unnatural, unsettling. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, trying to block out the cold. Mark, however, seemed unfazed. He flashed another grin at his friends and motioned for them to follow him. "Let's get this over with," he said, his voice louder than necessary, trying to mask the slight tremor in his own voice. Even he wasn't immune to the eerie atmosphere that had settled around the place. But he wasn't about to back down. Not now. Alex, ever the skeptic, pulled out his flashlight, clicking it on and scanning the area. His light flickered, catching the shape of the bridge in the distance. He snorted, rolling his eyes. "See? No ghosts, just a creepy old bridge." But even as he said it, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees seemed to carry something else. A whisper, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind. Sarah froze, the hair on the back of her neck standing up. Mark and Alex didn't notice, too focused on the bridge ahead, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching them. "I don't like this," Sarah muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "This place, it's giving me the creeps." Alex laughed, but there was a hint of nervousness behind his laughter. "Come on, Sarah. It's all in your head. We're just going to walk across, and that's it." They moved forward, their steps crunching on the gravel path. As they reached the entrance of the bridge, the wooden planks seemed to groan under their weight, as if the bridge itself was alive, reacting to their presence. Mark went first, stepping onto the bridge, followed by Sarah and Alex. The bridge seemed to stretch out in front of them, the dark shadows on either side making it feel as though they were walking into a void. There were no streetlights out here, and their flashlights only provided a small circle of light in the encompassing dark. The bridge itself was old. Its wooden beams creaked and shifted underfoot. The rails twisted with rust, and the floorboards felt unstable in places. The further they walked, the more the sense of unease grew. It was almost as if the bridge was pulling them deeper into the darkness. The air was thick with a strange kind of stillness. The trees were silent, no longer rustling in the wind, as though the forest itself had fallen quiet. The only sound was the faint creaking of the bridge with every step they took. It was unnerving. Sarah looked over at Mark, who seemed to be walking faster now, eager to get across and prove that there was nothing to be afraid of. Alex, meanwhile, was scanning every corner, convinced that whatever was supposed to be lurking here wouldn't show itself. But then came a strange sensation, a presence, something not quite right, as if the air itself was charged with an energy they couldn't explain. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling now. Alex looked at her, his face serious. "Hear what?" It was then that the faint whispering began. At first, it was almost imperceptible, like a breeze carrying a sound too distant to make sense of. But as they walked deeper, it grew louder, clearer. Words, or what sounded like words, were being spoken in a language none of them could understand. It was soft, like a lullaby, but it was enough to make the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. "Okay, this is getting creepy," Mark said, his voice lower now, less sure. He glanced around, but saw nothing in the darkness beyond the reach of their flashlights. "Let's just finish crossing," Alex said, trying to keep his voice steady, but even he couldn't deny that something was off. The whispers, they seemed to follow them, growing louder with every step. Suddenly, the air grew colder, so cold that it took their breath away. A deep, biting chill seeped into their bones, and they could see their breath fog in the cold night air. Mark's grip on his flashlight tightened, and Sarah felt a wave of panic rise within her. Then, there it was. A soft thud. A noise from behind them. They all turned, their flashlights flickering, and that's when they saw it. A shadow, standing at the far end of the bridge, just beyond the reach of their light. It was impossible to make out any details, but they could feel it, watching them. The whispering stopped. The bridge groaned again, and for the first time that night, none of them felt brave anymore. The moment they stepped onto the bridge, a strange and unsettling feeling swept over them. It was subtle at first, something that was almost imperceptible, but it grew stronger as they continued. The air around them felt thicker, almost viscous, like they were walking through water. It wasn't just the cold that made them shiver. It was something else. The bridge seemed to be alive with an energy that they couldn't quite explain, and it wasn't the kind of energy that felt friendly or welcoming. It was heavy, suffocating, like the entire place was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. They were no longer just standing on a bridge. They had stepped into a space that existed outside of time, a place where the normal rules didn't apply. And that was when the first real wave of unease hit them. Sarah, who had been walking a little slower than the others, felt her skin prickle. The hair on the back of her neck stood up, and she instinctively pulled her jacket tighter around herself. She could feel something, a presence, watching them from the shadows, something hidden just beyond the reach of their flashlights. Her heart began to race, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. "I don't like this," Sarah whispered, barely audible, as though speaking louder would bring whatever was lurking out of the shadows. Mark, who had been leading the group, paused and looked over his shoulder at her. "What's wrong?" he asked, sounding more concerned than he had before. He had been excited at the beginning, eager to prove the legend wrong, but now even he could sense that something was off. Sarah shook her head. "I don't know. I just feel like we're being watched. It's like something is following us." Alex, walking behind Sarah, scoffed. He always prided himself on his ability to rationalize and laugh off anything that seemed out of place. "You're just freaked out by the dark. There's nothing here, Sarah. It's all in your head." But Sarah wasn't so sure. She turned around quickly, glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see something, anything there. But when she did, there was only the pitch-black night, the eerie stillness of the forest beyond the bridge, and the quiet rustling of leaves. Nothing. Still, the sense of being watched didn't go away. It was suffocating, like the darkness itself was closing in on them, pressing in from all sides. She looked back at her friends. Mark and Alex were still walking ahead, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was something not right. She wished they could just turn around and leave, that something told her that they had already crossed into a place where leaving wasn't so simple. "Let's just keep going," Alex said, his voice casual, almost too casual. He was trying to act like nothing was wrong, but Sarah could hear the slight tremor in his voice that betrayed his growing unease. "We're almost halfway across. We'll be fine." Alex's words were meant to reassure them, but as they walked, the tension only grew. Mark, who was leading the way, was starting to look nervous too. It was subtle at first, just a slight shift in his posture, but it was enough to make Sarah realize that he wasn't as confident as he had been earlier. He seemed to be on edge, his eyes darting around as if he was searching for something. And then, without warning, Mark stopped. The abruptness of it caught Sarah and Alex off guard. They both nearly walked into him. "Did you hear that?" Mark asked, his voice low, his tone suddenly serious. Sarah and Alex exchanged a look, unsure of what to make of it. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind brushing through the trees and the faint, eerie rustling of the leaves. But then, there it was, a soft sound, barely perceptible at first, as if someone were whispering from a distance. The sound didn't seem to come from any one direction. It seemed to surround them, as if the very air was speaking to them. "I heard it too," Sarah murmured, her voice barely audible, her voice trembling despite herself. It was a whisper, too faint to make out any words, but there was something about it, something unsettling. It wasn't the whisper of someone close by, not the kind of whisper you might hear when someone was just out of sight. This was different. This whisper seemed to come from inside the bridge itself, like it was embedded in the wood, the stone, the very air they were breathing. Mark's face paled, and he quickly scanned the area with his flashlight. Did anyone else hear that? I swear it sounded like someone was right behind us. Alex, always the skeptic, shook his head, trying to dismiss it. It's probably just the wind, or some animal. There's nothing here. But even as Alex spoke, he couldn't help but glance nervously at the darkness around them. The wind had stopped for a moment, and the silence was so thick, it felt as if the world had fallen into a hushed, unnatural stillness. The bridge groaned under their feet, the creaking sound sending a chill down their spines. Sarah felt her heart rate quicken. The bridge was alive in a way she couldn't understand, and the whispers were growing louder. Suddenly, Mark stepped forward again, his pace quickening, almost as if he were trying to outrun something. Sarah and Alex followed, and for a moment, everything seemed normal again, except it wasn't. The oppressive feeling, the weight in the air, hadn't gone away. If anything, it had only grown stronger. Then, as if it had been waiting for just the right moment, the whispering returned, clearer this time. It was still soft, but now it seemed like it was right behind them. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was several, overlapping, murmuring in a language none of them understood. The words were foreign, their cadence strange, but the tone was unmistakable. It was demanding, like a voice trying to convey something that couldn't be fully heard, something that didn't want to be heard. Sarah stopped dead in her tracks, her flashlight trembling in her hand as she swung it around, scanning the empty space behind them. But once again, there was nothing, only the darkness, no figure, no movement, nothing but the wind, the creaking of the bridge, and that unsettling whisper that refused to fade. "I don't think we should be here," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes wide with fear. She had never been one to believe in ghosts or supernatural forces, but this was different. Something was wrong. They weren't alone. Mark turned to her, his face drawn with anxiety. "You feel it too, don't you?" Alex, who had been trying to keep his composure, nodded slowly. "I don't know what's going on, but it doesn't feel right. We need to keep moving." But as they continued, the whispering began to take on a new tone, more urgent, more insistent. It was no longer just a whisper. It was a voice now, calling out, begging, or perhaps warning them. Sarah's heart raced as the voice seemed to wrap itself around her, as if it was speaking directly to her. She couldn't make out the words, but the fear it invoked in her was real. Every fiber of her being screamed to turn around and leave. Her legs felt heavy, as if the weight of the bridge itself was dragging her down, trying to keep her from leaving. She was caught in something ancient, something she couldn't comprehend. It was pulling her deeper into its grip, and the more she fought against it, the harder it became to move. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The air grew still again, but it wasn't a relief. It felt more like a pause. Like the world itself had taken a breath and was about to exhale something even worse. The silence hung between them like a thick fog, suffocating and impenetrable. "Let's just keep going," Alex said again, his voice shaky now, but he tried to sound confident. It was the only thing they could do, right? Move forward, keep walking. But even his words felt hollow, like they were just filling the space between the growing panic inside them. They walked in silence for what felt like an eternity. With each step, the air seemed to grow colder, denser. The ground beneath them groaned again. And this time, it wasn't just the old wood of the bridge that made the sound. It was the bridge itself, as though it was reacting to their presence. The wood creaked, the metal rails twisted and bent. And in that moment, they knew they weren't walking through a normal bridge. This wasn't just an old, decaying structure. It was something more. Something that didn't belong in this world. And as they reached the halfway point of the bridge, they all realized one terrifying truth. They weren't alone anymore. As the clock struck midnight, something shifted in the very air around them. The bridge, which had seemed so ordinary just moments ago, began to groan beneath their feet. The sound was low, a creaking noise that made the wooden planks vibrate with each step they took. It wasn't the normal creak of an old structure. It was something deeper, like the bridge itself was coming to life, stirring from some long-forgotten slumber. Mark was the first to notice the change. He stopped mid-step, his flashlight flickering as it swept over the path ahead. "What the hell?" he muttered, the words barely escaping his lips. It was as though the air itself had thickened, pressing in on them from all sides. The cool breeze that had accompanied them since they first arrived had suddenly stopped, replaced by a stillness so oppressive it felt like the very atmosphere was holding its breath. The forest around them seemed to fall silent as well, the usual rustling of leaves and distant cries of night animals gone. And then the moonlight, so bright just moments ago, seemed to fade, the shadows growing longer and deeper. It wasn't just the normal shift of nightfall. It felt like the darkness itself was gathering, swallowing the light. The trees on either side of the bridge seemed to grow taller, their twisted limbs reaching for them, as if trying to pull them back into the suffocating blackness of the forest. The hairs on the back of Sarah's neck stood up, and she couldn't help but feel the oppressive weight of the night press down on her. The whispers that had been softly lingering in the background began to grow louder, almost as though the bridge was speaking to them, or worse, calling to them. "Guys, we need to leave, now," Sarah said, her voice strained with panic. Her feet felt like they were rooted to the ground, but her heart was racing, telling her to run, to get away from this place before it was too late. Alex, who had been trying to keep his cool through everything so far, turned to Sarah, his face ashen. "I don't know if we can," he said, his voice quivering slightly. He took a step backward, his flashlight wavering, as if the light itself was fighting against the dark that seemed to grow thicker around them. He looked ahead, toward the end of the bridge where they had started. At least, they thought they had. The path seemed to stretch on, the darkness swallowing up the horizon. The bridge didn't seem to end anymore. It just kept going, further and further into the void. "What the hell is happening?" Mark said, his voice rising with anxiety. He tried to turn around and retrace their steps, but as he did, it was as though the bridge had no end. The path behind them had disappeared into the deepening shadows. It was impossible to see where they had come from. The way back had vanished, just as the bridge had become an endless road into darkness. "This isn't right," Sarah said, her words shaking with fear. She took a step back, but every direction she turned, the same oppressive blackness surrounded them, swallowing the edges of their flashlights and distorting everything in its path. There was no escape. It was as if the bridge had trapped them in an infinite loop, pulling them deeper into something that wasn't supposed to exist. They weren't just on a bridge anymore. They were in a place where the rules of reality didn't apply. Mark was already moving forward, faster now, his footsteps echoing in the silent void. "We have to go," he said, almost to himself. "We have to." Before he could finish, there was a sharp noise. A soft rustling at first, like someone was behind them, moving just out of sight. But when Sarah turned, no one was there. The bridge creaked again, and the whispering grew louder, more insistent. The voices were unintelligible, overlapping in a cacophony of distant calls and pleas. She could feel the air turn colder, colder than she thought was possible. It bit at her skin, freezing her to the bone. Alex moved closer to Sarah, the terror on his face growing with each passing second. "We need to get out of here," he said urgently. But his words were drowned out by a sharp crack, the unmistakable sound of something snapping under pressure. Sarah gasped and turned to look at the source, her heart pounding in her chest. It was Mark. He had stopped in the middle of the bridge, his body stiff, his head slightly tilted. He wasn't moving, and his flashlight had gone dim, casting erratic shadows along the path. He stood there, motionless, like he was frozen in place, locked in the grip of something invisible. "Mark," Sarah called out, her voice trembling. For a moment, nothing happened. The only sound was the faint rustling of leaves far off in the distance. The wind had picked up again, whipping around them, but it felt empty. There was no relief in it. The air was still thick, as if the entire forest was closing in on them, and the bridge itself was starting to shudder beneath their feet. "Mark, what's going on?" Alex asked, his voice strained. He stepped closer, reaching out to touch Mark's shoulder, but before he could make contact, Mark suddenly turned. It wasn't a normal movement. There was a jerky, unnatural quality to it, as if something was forcing him to move. His head whipped around, and his eyes, wide and unblinking, locked onto theirs. "Mark?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. She took a step forward, but a cold wave of fear swept over her, freezing her in place. Something in Mark's eyes was wrong. The light that had once been there, the warmth of his usual confidence, was gone. In its place was only emptiness. Deep, empty blackness that seemed to look right through them. Without warning, Mark took a step back. His body jerked once, twice, as if pulled by some invisible force. He was moving away from them, slowly, as though he were being guided by something, or dragged. Then, as Sarah and Alex watched in stunned silence, Mark disappeared. One moment, he was standing there, his face a mask of confusion and fear. The next, he was gone, vanished into thin air, like a shadow swallowed by the darkness. No noise, no scream, nothing. "Mark!" Sarah screamed, panic flooding her chest as she reached out toward the spot where he had stood. There was no trace of him, no footprints, no marks on the bridge, nothing. Just the same relentless, oppressive silence, broken only by the growing rush of wind that seemed to scream in their ears. Alex's face went pale. "Where did he go? What happened?" His voice cracked, and for the first time, Sarah saw true fear in his eyes. Fear she had never seen in him before. They were completely alone now, alone on a bridge that had just swallowed their friend. "Mark!" Sarah shouted again, her voice breaking as she looked around frantically, hoping, praying that he would just appear, that he would stumble out of the shadows and laugh, telling them it was a prank, a joke. But there was nothing, just the deep, endless silence. "We need to get out of here," Alex said, his voice tight with urgency. He grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her away from the spot where Mark had disappeared. But it was too late. The air was heavy around them, suffocating, and the darkness seemed to close in even more. The bridge felt like it was alive, pulsing with an energy that neither of them could understand. The whispers, which had faded when Mark disappeared, now started again, louder this time, angrier. It wasn't just a soft murmur anymore. It was a chaotic chorus of voices, all rising at once, overlapping, calling for something or someone. And Sarah realized in a burst of cold dread that it wasn't just Mark they wanted. It was them. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "We need to leave. Right now." But as they turned to run, the path behind them was gone. There was no end to the bridge anymore, no way out. They were trapped. Trapped in a place where reality no longer made sense, and the whispers grew louder with every step they took. And in the distance, something moved in the shadows, something watching them, waiting. Alex and Sarah stood frozen on the bridge, their hearts hammering in their chests. The place felt even more surreal now, as though the very world around them had shifted into something unfamiliar. The silence that had followed Mark's sudden disappearance had settled like a thick blanket, suffocating every thought they had. They could hear their own breath, shallow and ragged, but there was nothing else. Nothing. It didn't make sense. How could Mark just vanish like that? One moment, he was right there with them, and the next, gone. Alex's mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't come up with anything. There was no way to explain it. Mark had simply disappeared. Like a ghost. Like a shadow swallowed by the night. They had already searched the area around them, calling out for Mark, hoping against hope that he'd pop out from behind one of the bridge's thick beams, or emerge from the darkness with a sheepish grin, telling them it was all a prank. But nothing. Not a single sign. No footprints. No sounds. Just silence. It was as though Mark had never existed in the first place. "Maybe we missed something," Sarah said, her voice trembling with the fear she could no longer hide. She was trying to sound brave, but her words didn't carry the same weight as they had before. Now each word felt hollow, as if the air itself was mocking her attempt to make sense of the impossible. "We have to look again," Alex muttered, trying to fight the panic rising inside him. He was the rational one, the skeptic. But now, in the face of the unknown, everything he believed in was crumbling. There was no logic, no reasoning. The bridge had taken Mark, and they were powerless to stop it. They retraced their steps, moving along the creaking planks, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. The moonlight had all but vanished now, replaced by an oppressive, almost unnatural darkness that wrapped itself around them like a living thing. Sarah's flashlight flickered and dimmed, the beam weakening as though it too was struggling to survive in this black void. Alex's flashlight did the same. It was like the darkness was fighting back, pushing against the light they tried to use to push it away. "Mark," Sarah called again, her voice more desperate this time. She was shaking, her breath quickening as she stumbled over the uneven boards. She turned her head rapidly, as if expecting to see him suddenly materialize behind her. But there was nothing, only shadows, stretching out in every direction, mocking their efforts to find him. The quiet was unbearable now. They could still hear the distant rustle of leaves in the trees around them, but everything else had fallen silent. There was no wind anymore, no whispering leaves or animal sounds, just that same suffocating stillness. And the longer they searched, the more they felt as if the bridge itself was moving. It was subtle at first, a slight shift in the wood beneath their feet, but it quickly grew worse. The ground felt unstable, like it could give way beneath them at any moment. Alex paused, his feet sinking into the wooden planks, as if the bridge were pulling him down. He looked down, and for a brief moment, he could have sworn that the boards were warping beneath him, twisting as though they were alive. The ground breathed, and in that moment, the bridge felt less like a physical structure and more like a creature, its bones groaning and shifting, waiting to claim its next victim. "Alex," Sarah's voice trembled. "What's happening to this place? It's not normal." "I know," Alex replied, swallowing hard. He could barely speak, his throat tight with fear. "Something's wrong. This whole place feels wrong." The bridge creaked again, louder this time, the sound of the wood straining against an unseen force. Sarah stumbled as the planks beneath her shifted, nearly throwing her off balance. She grabbed Alex's arm to steady herself, her grip tightening as she tried to calm the panic building inside her. "Mark!" she screamed once more, her voice hoarse from the desperation that flooded her. But this time, there was an answer. A faint echo, a whisper, almost lost in the wind. "Mark?" Alex shouted, his voice cracking, almost pleading. He stared into the darkness, trying to catch a glimpse of his friend. But the answer that came wasn't Mark's voice. It was something else. A whisper, faint but clear enough to send chills down his spine. The words were indistinct, but there was no mistaking the tone. Urgent, desperate, almost pleading. And it was coming from deep within the bridge itself. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes were wide with terror as she looked at Alex, her hands shaking. Alex nodded, his heart racing in his chest. "It's him. It's Mark. He's still out there." But as they stood there, straining to hear, the whispers became louder, growing in intensity. They were no longer just whispers. They were voices now, layered over one another, overlapping, calling, beckoning him deeper into the darkness. The voices were not just Mark's. They were something else, something ancient. The words were too distorted to make sense of, but the sound itself was suffocating. It felt like the voices were coming from every direction, all around them. But when they turned to look, there was nothing, no one. Just the endless, oppressive void of the bridge. "Alex, we need to get out of here," Sarah whispered urgently, her eyes darting around in panic. Her breathing was shallow, uneven, and every instinct inside her screamed for them to leave, to get away before they too became part of this nightmare. But Alex couldn't move. His feet felt heavy, as though the bridge itself was holding him in place, anchoring him to the spot. The voices grew louder, their urgency rising, almost pleading. But there was no escaping them. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't turn away from the pull of the darkness around them. "Please," Alex muttered, trying to force himself to move, but his body felt frozen. His legs refused to cooperate, as though they were glued to the planks beneath him. The bridge swayed again, this time with a force that sent a tremor through the air. It wasn't just the wind. It was the bridge itself, shifting, moving, alive in a way that no structure should be. And then, through the overwhelming whispering, they both heard it. A voice. Not a whisper, but Mark's voice, clear and faint, calling from deep within the darkness. Help. It was a cry of desperation, distant, barely audible, but it was enough to send Sarah's heart racing. "Mark!" she shouted, the tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Mark, where are you?" But as the last of the words left her mouth, something happened. The ground beneath them shook violently, and a loud crack echoed through the air. Alex barely had time to react before he was yanked forward, his body stumbling as though something had gripped him from the other side. His flashlight flickered, casting long, jerky shadows along the bridge as he tried to steady himself. Sarah reached out to grab him, but her hand met only empty air. The next moment, she felt a sharp pain in her chest as something pulled her backward toward the edge of the bridge. "Alex!" she screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the growing cacophony of voices around them. The whispers were so loud now that they felt like they were inside her skull. 1,000 voices pressing against her brain. It was unbearable. In a moment of sheer panic, Sarah turned and ran, her feet pounding against the wooden boards as she tried to break free of the oppressive grip of the bridge. But no matter how fast she ran, the path never seemed to end. It stretched before her, the darkness closing in, until she could no longer tell where the bridge ended and where the world began. She kept running, her breath ragged, her heart beating in her chest like a drum. The whispers followed her, growing louder, closer, and in the back of her mind, the image of Mark's face, the way he had disappeared so suddenly, kept flashing before her eyes. She wasn't sure if she was running to escape or if she was running towards something that was about to claim her as well. The bridge was alive, and it wasn't letting them go. No matter how fast they ran, it seemed the end of the bridge was always just beyond their reach. The wooden planks stretched on endlessly, mocking them, as though the bridge itself was toying with them, refusing to allow them any kind of escape. Every step they took only seemed to pull them deeper into the heart of the darkness. The more they pushed forward, the more they felt like they were sinking into a place that was not meant to be real. Alex's breathing was frantic, the sound of his labored gasps mixing with the growing intensity of the whispers that surrounded them. It wasn't just one voice anymore. The whispering had morphed into something far more sinister. The voices, once soft and unintelligible, were now loud and distinct, overlapping, layering on top of each other, as if the souls of the bridge's past victims were speaking all at once. Their words, full of despair, were a mixture of pleading and warning. "I told you," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking with a mix of terror and regret. Her legs burned, but she couldn't stop running, even though every fiber of her being screamed for her to give up. The words she had spoken earlier echoed in her mind, haunting her as the truth began to take shape. She had known, somewhere deep down, she had known that something was terribly wrong, that the bridge wasn't just an abandoned structure with a dark story. It was alive, conscious, malicious. "I told you we shouldn't have come." Her words were soft but heavy, almost as though the bridge itself had forced her to speak them. The coldness in the air seemed to bite deeper, and the sound of her breath grew louder in her ears. The path stretched on, impossibly long, and each step felt heavier than the last. They weren't just running from a ghost story. They were trapped, locked in a place where time and space had no meaning. Alex didn't answer her at first. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear as he pushed himself harder. His flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows against the bridge's weathered boards. Every corner of the bridge seemed to stretch farther away the more they moved, until they couldn't tell if they were moving forward at all. It felt as though the bridge was responding to them, pulling them deeper into itself, the whispers growing louder and more urgent. "No," Alex muttered, shaking his head, trying to block out the suffocating reality that was closing in on him. "We have to keep going. We have to escape. We can't stop now." But Sarah knew it was futile. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, the truth that had been creeping up on her with every passing second. She had been foolish to think they could outrun it. They weren't just stuck on a haunted bridge. They were prisoners, trapped in a nightmare that had no beginning or end. The bridge wasn't just haunted by the spirits of those who had disappeared over the years. It wasn't just a place where ghosts lingered in the shadows. The bridge itself was a living, breathing entity, feeding off the fear and confusion of anyone who crossed its path. As Sarah's mind raced with the realization of what they were up against, she felt a shift in the atmosphere around them. The temperature dropped, a freezing chill that seemed to seep into her very bones. It wasn't just the cold of the night anymore. It was as if the bridge had exhaled a wave of frost that surrounded them, clinging to their skin, freezing them in place. She looked at Alex, her eyes wide with panic. Alex," she started, but her words faltered as she saw something in his eyes, something that mirrored her own realization. He had understood. The truth had dawned on him too. The bridge wasn't just an old structure from a forgotten time. It was an ancient trap, a place where the living and the dead could not escape, a place where time was distorted, and where those who entered would never leave. The whispering wasn't just the voices of the past. They were trapped here too, the souls of the lost, caught in an endless loop, forever bound to the bridge. "Alex," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. It's alive, isn't it?" Alex didn't answer right away. He just kept moving, pushing himself faster, as if the faster he ran, the further he could get away from the truth. But deep down, he knew that running wouldn't save them. There was no running from this, no escaping. The bridge owned them now. They were no longer just visitors. They were part of it. They had crossed the line, and now they were just as much a part of the bridge's dark legacy as the countless others who had disappeared over the years. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the bridge itself was calling out to them. The voices of the past were no longer distant. They were right there, surrounding them, pressing in on all sides. They could hear the other passengers now, the ones who had vanished before them. Their voices, filled with despair and rage, echoed around them, carried by the wind, blending into a single, tortured cacophony. "I didn't want to die here," one voice cried, the words barely audible over the others. "Help me. Please, don't leave me here." Another voice followed, more guttural, full of anger and pain. "We're stuck here. We can't leave. You can't leave." And then a third voice, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. "It's too late for all of us." Sarah's chest tightened as the words hit her, hard. She stopped running, her legs shaking beneath her, as she looked around, trying to make sense of the disembodied voices that filled the air. They were not just sounds, they were real. The ghosts of the lost, of those who had walked this bridge before them, were speaking to them now. They had become part of the bridge, just as Sarah and Alex were destined to become. A chill ran through her spine, and she turned to look at Alex, her eyes filled with a mix of terror and disbelief. "You're not getting out of here, are we?" Her voice was almost a whisper now, as if speaking too loudly would draw the bridge's attention. Alex didn't answer her at first. He was too focused on the endless path before them, the dark void that stretched on for eternity. But then, with a slow, heavy breath, he nodded, his face pale and drawn. "No, we're not. This bridge, it's not just haunted. It's alive, Sarah. It traps you here. Forever." His voice was hoarse now, full of the weight of the truth. And as the words left his lips, Sarah felt something inside of her snap. The horror that had been growing inside of her, building with every whisper and every twist of the bridge's path, finally sank in. They were part of the story now, just like the others. They would be forgotten, their names whispered by the next group of foolish souls who dared to venture out onto the cursed bridge. They were trapped in eternity, bound to the bridge like all the others before them. The bridge groaned again, the sound vibrating through their bodies, shaking them to their core. The air grew colder still, and the voices, those trapped souls, seemed to rise in a frantic chorus, their whispers growing louder and louder, until it felt as though the entire world was speaking at once. The ground beneath them trembled, and Sarah grabbed Alex's arm, her grip tight with fear. The reality of their situation had fully set in now. They weren't escaping. They weren't going anywhere. "We have to keep moving," Alex said, his voice barely a whisper, but there was no conviction in his words. He was just as lost as she was. "I told you," Sarah whispered again, but this time there was no regret in her voice. She was beyond that now. The truth had been revealed to them, and there was nothing more to say. They had come to the bridge looking for answers, but the only thing they had found was their doom. And as the bridge seemed to grow larger and darker, they both understood. The bridge didn't want them to escape. It wanted them to stay, forever. As the minutes stretched into hours, the world around them seemed to bend and warp in a way that felt impossible. The bridge, which had once appeared so ordinary and harmless, now felt like it was a part of something far larger, far darker. Time had stopped, and with it, the reality they once knew. The bridge didn't just hold them, it had consumed them, and now time moved according to its whims. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, as though the very fabric of the world had been ripped apart, leaving them stuck in a place where nothing made sense. The sounds, the whispers, the coldness, they were all an inescapable part of this twisted place. The bridge was not simply a structure. It had become alive, its influence spreading through every fiber of their being. Sarah and Alex had long since stopped moving, They had tried to escape countless times, running toward the end of the bridge, only to find that it never ended. The darkness had swallowed them whole, pulling them into a place where they could no longer perceive the passing of time. Their legs were numb, their bodies stiff, but still they remained, rooted to the bridge, as if some unseen force had latched onto them, holding them in place. At first, they had thought they were simply tired, or that they had somehow gone mad from the stress of being trapped. But then, as the minutes passed into hours, they began to realize that it wasn't just the passage of time that was distorted. It was their very sense of existence. They were no longer part of the world they had known. They were no longer part of reality. The bridge had made them a part of its dark web, and there was no escaping it. They were now inextricably linked to it. Sarah tried to speak, to break the silence that had surrounded them for what felt like an eternity, but her voice was hollow, echoing in the dead air around them. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt the warmth of the sun or the fresh air on her skin. All she could feel now was the cold, an all-consuming chill that had settled deep within her bones. Her eyes were wide with a sense of desperation that she couldn't shake, but it was as though the more she fought to move, the more the bridge tightened its grip on her. Alex, standing beside her, seemed to be in a similar state. His eyes were glassy, unfocused, as if his very soul had been worn down by the unrelenting torment of the bridge. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat, as if his body was no longer capable of forming them. It wasn't just the silence that haunted them. It was the sensation of being watched. Something, or perhaps everything, on the bridge was observing them, waiting for the inevitable moment when they too would fade into the darkness. The bridge had already claimed their bodies. Now it was just a matter of time before it claimed their spirits. And then, as though it had been orchestrated by some invisible force, the first hint of light appeared at the horizon, a sliver of pale yellow that sliced through the darkness, spreading outward like the softest breath of hope. The sun began to rise. It was as if the bridge itself had allowed them to witness this moment, only to rip it away. They were no longer in the world that existed outside of the bridge. This was a different place, a realm that existed only between the shadows and the whispers. The world beyond the bridge was no longer a part of them. They had been severed from it, and they would never see the light of day again. Sarah felt her heart sink as she looked at the rising sun, her eyes drawn to it, despite the hopelessness that filled her chest. The truth had already begun to settle over her, like a heavy blanket, suffocating her. She had wanted to believe, all along, that they could escape, that they could defeat the curse of the haunted bridge. But now, as the light touched the edges of the bridge, she realized that they had already become part of its horrifying legacy. The moments when they had felt their humanity slipping away, when they had wondered whether they were simply walking shadows, had become their reality. They had become the next whispers, the next lost souls who would be forgotten by time, but eternally bound to the cursed structure that had tracked them. There would be no memorial, no marker, no remembrance. They would not be mourned. They would simply fade into the bridge's story, swallowed by the darkness, a part of the cursed history that would only be whispered about for years to come. Alex's hand reached for Sarah, and she took it. The coldness of their skin, a reflection of the hopelessness they both felt. But their fingers were not the only thing connected anymore. They were part of the bridge, and the bridge was part of them. There was no distinction between their souls and the structure that had ensnared them. The feeling was overpowering, as though the bridge had absorbed them entirely, becoming an extension of their very existence. Sarah could feel the voices surrounding them again, clearer this time, more distinct. They were the voices of the ones who had gone before, each one a story of loss, desperation, and failure. They had tried to escape, just like Alex and Sarah, but they had never made it. They had never made it because the bridge didn't want them to leave. The bridge was a prison, and the souls of those who had been trapped there were doomed to wander forever. Their voices echoing in the wind as a reminder to anyone who dared venture too close. The sun was fully up now, but it didn't feel like day. The light was wrong, distorted, unnatural, and though the light touched the bridge, it didn't offer any warmth. It was as though the bridge itself was blocking the warmth, keeping it away, keeping them in the cold embrace of the shadows. And as the light grew stronger, so too did the whispers, until they drowned out everything else. The sound of the wind, the rustling of leaves, even the faintest creak of the bridge. Everything was drowned by the voices, all rising in unison. And that was when they realized they hadn't escaped. They would never escape. They were a part of the bridge now. They were just another layer of memory, another whisper lost in the endless night. Their bodies were still there, standing on the bridge, but they were not really there anymore. Their minds, their souls, had become part of the legend, the curse that held the bridge in its grip. They had become nothing more than a warning to anyone else who might venture onto the bridge. As they stood there, waiting for the next group of curious souls to arrive, they felt the weight of the truth. The bridge was a trap, and once it had claimed its victims, it would never let them go. The next night, a new group of strangers would come, drawn by the same whispers, the same stories that had once lured them. And like them, they would disappear, never to be seen again. The cycle would repeat itself. The bridge would continue to claim victims, and those victims would continue to become part of it, adding their voices. It didn't matter how many times the bridge was crossed, how many people came seeking answers, seeking to defy the myth. The bridge was alive, and it would never let go. The whispers of Sarah and Alex would merge with the others, and soon no one would remember their names. They would become the bridge's eternal prisoners, bound to it forever, a part of its twisted, endless night. And the Haunted Bridge of Maine, as it always had, would continue to take the next, and the next, and the next, until there was no more, until nothing remained but the bridge that would never let them go.